What was Tears of the Kingdom's budget? For that matter, what was Breath of the Wild's budget? AAA game development is expensive and spiralling ever upward, and if there are two games which evidently cost Nintendo a significant amount, it's the Hyrule of the Wild duology. What did development of those two titles actually cost them? Breath of the Wild's budget is often quoted as $120 million, but this is largely an estimation based off a quote from Shigeru Miyamoto that may have been taken a little out of context. And generally, Nintendo themselves are very cagey on this kind of information. So, in this video, we're going to aim to retroactively figure out a best estimate for the budgets for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. We're going to look at the industry context, the costs of the engine, the staffing, the art and cinematics, quality assurance, including testing, and finally the marketing. We're going to look at how Nintendo looks to offset the costs and to recycle assets, and finally, hopefully, come to a reasonable estimate as to what these two titanic Hyrulean adventures actually cost to make. First of all, let's give a bit of industry context. Big budget titles frequently take many years to develop, and the budgets are often extensive. Spider-Man 2 was reportedly $300 million to produce, Starfield at least that amount, Cyberpunk 2077 in the same ballpark, while Red Dead Redemption reportedly clocked in at $540 million, with $300 million of that on marketing alone. Of course, all these games are 4K extravaganzas on technology significantly more advanced than the Nintendo Switch, so you wouldn't necessarily expect Nintendo's budgets to be quite this high. 2017's Horizon Zero Dawn was reported to be a comparatively parsimonious $47 million to maybe $50 million, and 2012's Halo 4, once reportedly the most expensive game ever, was probably not much more than $100 million. Phil Spencer told Polygon in 2012 that nothing's even close to their spend on Halo 4. Well, we're in a different world of spending now. When discussing budgets such as these, I'm always reminded of Hiroshi Yamauchi's comments. Yamauchi-san, the great-grandson of Nintendo's founder and its president for more than half a century before his retirement at the dawn of the GameCube era, was scathing about ballooning budgets and people who thought the way to expand the gaming industry was simply to pour money into graphics. He said, "There really are just an overwhelmingly huge number of people out there that know nothing about the business of video games. The game business is a tough one, and it's not been around for that long either, so there are people out there that find this industry incredibly interesting, venture capitalists in particular. That's why these people are pouring money into the field right now. The more amazing graphics and sound you put into a game, the longer it takes to finish. Not just a year, but now more like a year and a half or 2 years. So then your development costs balloon, and when you finally put it out, you have zero guarantee of it selling. That's what the game industry is today." His words are just as resonant today as they ever were, but while some AAA devs might nod their heads ruefully at his words, Nintendo are fast playing catch-up, recognizing that they cannot completely defy gravity and they need to be able to deliver games at a scale without breaking their business model. This was the topic of an investor Q&A prior to the launch of the Nintendo Switch, and I think before we get into the budget breakdowns, it's worth reading this whole exchange in full, as it really lets us get into the nuances of Nintendo's thinking when it comes to AAA game development. The question posed was this: Nintendo's core business is in the game industry, and the biggest problem there is the rising cost in terms of time and money needed to develop one game. How are you addressing this problem? Then President Kimishima answered first. He said, "The cost of developing game software has certainly grown over the last 10 years. This is a big challenge, as there is no simple formula to calculate the size of how popular a game is going to be with consumers. That said, I think that developing with this in mind will be increasingly important." Then Genyo Takeda, now retired but then the senior managing director and technology fellow, added, "The thinking for a long time was that computer performance for a game should be dedicated entirely to the consumer's enjoyment. But now, times have changed, and the common sense is that the computer performance should also be used to improve productivity in making the game software itself. But what is most important is how we achieve balance. I'm going to let Mr. Miyamoto speak, as he has spent a lot of time and energy on raising the productivity of software development while doing this balancing act." Now, before we hear from Miyamoto-san, let's just reflect on that. He's basically saying that just using the technology available to put the maximum bang for the buck on screen is not enough any longer. They need to work smarter, not harder, and use more advanced tools and time-saving technology to make the production process smoother. This emphasis on game-making tools is something we'll return to in a second, but now let's hear from Shigeru Miyamoto, as these comments I think were taken out of context and deserve careful attention. Miyamoto-san said, "In striking that balance, while it's important that we do not overextend by putting an excessive amount of content in our games, the only solution is how to make software that sells well. There will be big hits somewhere in our business, and they support the games that fail and allow us to take on other challenges. So our basic premise is to create software that will sell in the range of at least 2 million units. We simply couldn't recoup our costs if we only released games in Japan that had sales of around 300,000 units, so the global market is our standard." Now, a number of outlets got wind of this comment based on a translated tweet and inferred from it that Breath of the Wild would need to sell 2 million copies to break even. A simple bit of maths followed that, at $60 a copy, the budget of Breath of the Wild was $120 million. This number has been widely quoted, but is quite flawed. For one thing, $60 doesn't include cuts for retailers, transport, breakage, manufacture, and all sorts of other areas of spending. But moreover, it's a misrepresentation of what Miyamoto-san was talking about in the first place. What he was saying is that 2 million is the standard measure of what Nintendo considers to be a game that sells well. But clearly this is a ballpark estimate, or as he puts it, a basic premise, and different games operate on a sliding scale. They want most of their titles to be able to pull in 2 million. This includes the Kirby's, the Mario Sports titles, the Fire Emblems and the Pokemon spin-offs, and all the run-of-the-mill games that make up the bulk of their lineup. Alongside, these will be experimental products which might really catch on or might fail completely. Ring Fit Adventure, Captain Toad, ARMS, the first Splatoon, or my beloved Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp, and so on. Then there are also titles that they rely on to provide cover for them to have the odd failure. The mainline Super Mario games, the sports series, and, although they only have a 32% stake in it, mainline Pokemon. I don't think therefore that it's a safe estimate to use $120 million, or even to use Miyamoto's statement at all, as a yardstick for Breath of the Wild's budget. Now, after Miyamoto-san spoke, Shinya Takahashi also chipped in. Takahashi-san is known for Nintendo Directs, but also is a senior director at Nintendo and has been for a long time. He is also on the board of directors on one of their new online infrastructure-focused companies, Nintendo Systems. His words are also very important. He said, "I also think the key word here is balance. This has a lot of aspects, such as knowing when we need to dedicate a lot of time and people to something and when we do not, or ways to leverage game engines that are used for general purposes and how to create our own game engines that lots of others can also make easy use of. For NX, the codename for the Switch, we're also thinking about many different development techniques based off these considerations. So this gives us a few avenues to start looking as we think about the budget for the Hyrule of the Wild games. First of all, we know that they did indeed dedicate a large number of people and a lot of time to Breath of the Wild. And in fact, I think there is good evidence that an early cost-saving measure for Tears of the Kingdom was seen in Ring Fit Adventure. Ring Fit Adventure was developed by the innovative EPD4 team, whose titles include 1-2-Switch, Labo, and Game Builder Garage. But for something like the scale of Ring Fit with its large worlds to run through, they needed some outside input. Many of the assets of Breath of the Wild could be repurposed therefore, particularly some of the programming it seems around the animals and landscape. Breath of the Wild's technical director, Takahiro Dota, was credited as offering engineering support. This is not the only title he's worked on between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. He also worked on Animal Crossing New Horizons, Link's Awakening, Super Mario Odyssey, Skyward Sword, Age of Calamity, and Metroid Prime Remastered. Nevertheless, he also brought over system architect for Breath of the Wild and programming lead for Tears of the Kingdom, Yuichiro Okamura, whose credits are usually far more Zelda focused. In fact, for as many people whose credits I can track, all of the engineering support team on Ring Fit Adventure worked on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as well. In some cases, they worked on multiple other games, including Animal Crossing, Super Mario Odyssey, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and in other cases, they basically just moonlighted on Ring Fit before returning to Hyrule soon after. Nevertheless, recall Shinya Takahashi's comments once more. They were not talking just about use of game engines, he also talked of knowing when we need to dedicate a lot of time and people to something and when we do not. We know that Nintendo often uses general-purpose teams that can travel from game to game. My credits breakdown of Animal Crossing and Splatoon linked above shows how, for long periods, EPD5 particularly shared art development staff between the two titles, and I can only imagine that for a company with dozens of games in development at any one time, allocating people to make best use of their talents in any given moment is a significant responsibility. The kind of games we're talking about are the ones they're giving significant resources to, and they shouldn't be surprising. Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, Splatoon, Animal Crossing. The availability of these teams to work on multiple projects doubtless helps Nintendo to limit their cost. Whereas other AAA studios might need to hire contractors for short bursts and then lay them off, Nintendo avoids this. This is not a small saving. Hiring new people can have a lot of attendant HR costs, from advertising to contracts to ensuring they have the necessary equipment, plus, for a company as secretive as Nintendo, legal issues around non-disclosure of key information. Plus, there is natural wastage, as people with experience can't be rehired because they've been snapped up by other projects, and people who are new don't always stick. Having a large standing staff of programmers who are committed to the company avoids all these hidden costs. The Zelda team also has the benefit of sharing the Kyoto offices with the rest of Nintendo, meaning that all sorts of issues from legal to data security to physical security to heating and electricity and technical support are all pulled across the entire office. All told, Nintendo is a good starting point to keep its costs relatively low. But another major area of expenditure, perhaps the most costly area, is simply staffing. In total, Tears of the Kingdom has more than 1,000 credits, but that's not to say all those people are working on the game full time, so we really need to zone in on the different sections to try to get some better calibrated estimates. First of all, as an outside guide to wages, we know that the average Nintendo salary in 2022 to 2023, according to their own accounting, was $75,000 across the company. Now, this is only an average, including all the different territories in which they operate, and when we're talking the core development staff in Japan, they are mostly likely to have a benefit of seniority and, of course, their crazy technical expertise, so their cost is likely to be significantly higher. After all, those salary averages may include relatively less paid positions, catering, cleaning, junior positions, etc. Now, the senior figures may not be remunerated quite as well as in some other companies. Only 4 of the directors in 2023 topped $1 million in pay, but I imagine the core Zelda team are on a very comfortable salary just the same. Having said that, for the very, very senior figures, their time may be split across multiple games, so for a budgeting perspective, the weight of, say, Eiji Aonuma or Takahiro Dota's salaries would not be borne solely by the Tears of the Kingdom budget, and therefore the pro rata annual costs of their involvement might not differ quite so much from the average. Therefore, for round numbers, let's use $150,000 per person per year for the senior members of the team, and for the rest of the team, let's go slightly higher than Nintendo's stated average at $80,000. Additional to this, there are hidden costs above the headline wage figure. Oyster HR figures that there would be an extra 11% to pay on taxes for those staff members. Plus, Nintendo has a pension scheme, and although it does not seem to provide Japanese workers with health insurance, Japan has a system of government-mandated health insurance itself, it does have a number of healthcare measures for its Japanese workers, with mental health care provision and an arrangement with a hospital for discounted health screenings for its female employees. Plus, all staff carry ongoing costs from HR to company-provided equipment, probably a particular concern during the pandemic, where suddenly large numbers of the development team would have been required to work remotely, having been used to all being in one office for decades. Still, because Tears has such a large staff, as well as requiring the most senior developers, it's also a great proving ground for newer staff members, so I think it's probably safe to estimate the absolute cost as $200,000 per senior figure per year spent exclusively on Tears of the Kingdom, and $100,000 for the majority of staff members. Of course, this represents 2022 to 2023 figures. In 2012 to 2013, when development on Breath of the Wild began in earnest, numbers would have been different, but if you account for Japanese inflation over that period, the equivalent cost would have been about $178,000 and $89,000. It's possible that the outsized success of the Switch inflated these wages even higher, but remember also that Nintendo is incredibly cautious and they have had long experience of booms and busts in their console strategy. I think with Breath of the Wild we can, for round figures, use $180,000 for the core staff and $90,000 per person per year for everyone else as our basis. Now, we know that the Wild game started with a team remaking Wind Waker HD. Tears of the Kingdom, on the other hand, came from DLC ideas that were originally for Breath of the Wild. The final Breath of the Wild DLC, The Champion's Ballad, released in December 2017, and soon after Nintendo confirmed they were working on the next game, presumably as there were ideas from Breath of the Wild and from the DLC development that could now be migrated into a full-fledged sequel. Because of this, even pinpointing the start of production is a little tricky. For this reason, and the general interconnectedness of the staff, I rather doubt that even Nintendo themselves have ever specifically crunched the numbers for individual games. However, the development team all starts with a small core of people who represent the absolute Heartland Zelda team, the people who are working exclusively on Zelda all the time. For Tears, this includes of course producer Eiji Aonuma, director Hidemaru Fujibayashi, assistant director Yuya Sato, and art director Satoru Takizawa. There are also other senior figures, such as the aforementioned Dota-san, who was the technical director on the Hyrule of the Wild titles but also lent his experience to other critical Nintendo projects. Also there was Wind Waker HD director Daiki Iwamoto, who was also working in a supervisory role on the other Zelda titles in this era, from A Link Between Worlds to Age of Calamity, plus sound director Hajime Wakai, who supervised sounds for, presumably, the Star Fox elements of Starlink Battle for Atlas during 2018, which is understandable since at that stage of Tears of the Kingdom's development, it seems unlikely that developing the game's soundscape was too immediate a priority. To make the maths a little easier, I'm going to count Breath of the Wild as starting in January 2013 and Tears of the Kingdom as having started full development properly in January 2018. Realistically, both were probably in development earlier, of course, and let's assume that with these key department heads and a few trusted people to work on prototypes, the game started out with about 20 staff members puttering around for a year on top-end salaries. This means that for their first year in development, they could have been spending $3.6 million for Breath of the Wild and $4 million for Tears of the Kingdom. We know that the early design work on Breath of the Wild concentrated on building the game's chemistry engine, while Dota-san's comment at GDC showed that the early game development of Tears required heavy input from the technical team, so we can assume that the first year or so of development work for both games was primarily focused on making the multiplicative gameplay system work. This might seem like an underestimate of the time and manpower being put into Tears of the Kingdom early on, but remember that this would also have been when work was taking place on Ring Fit Adventure, and so it would have defrayed a number of costs of building Breath of the Wild functionality into the engine when that game released first and was hugely profitable. In 2014 and 2019, the second year of full development for both games, production would have begun ramping up. About 30 credits are given for game design on Breath and double that on Tears, with staff on Tears mostly graduating either from previous Zeldas or having left the Mario and Luigi team at Alpha Dream to work at Monolith Soft's Zelda ARM. Many of the devs in this team have other credits such as ARMS, Mario and Luigi, 2018's Detective Pikachu, and Ring Fit Adventure. This suggests that they moved over to Tears of the Kingdom in 2018 as development ramped up. However, a very substantial number of Tears devs worked on Animal Crossing New Horizons. Animal Crossing, remember, was originally slated for 2019 but pushed into 2020. I don't think the game ultimately was missed from 2019 because the back 7 months of that year were already incredibly dense with games including some of the Switch's biggest selling titles like Pokemon Sword and Shield, Ring Fit Adventure, and Luigi's Mansion 3. Nevertheless, it fits the way Nintendo works that it will sometimes move developers en masse over to the most crucial projects it has in its arsenal at that point, and at that point, Animal Crossing was really the last big game they had left for some time. Remember that even before New Horizons conquered the world, New Leaf was the Nintendo 3DS's 6th highest selling title, and so there was every reason to think that this would be the biggest selling game of 2020. Because the large staff from now on, let's use the average wage as an estimate instead of the senior average wage. Realistically, we're assuming the team was not yet in full flow, so the average salary was probably a little bit higher, but equally we know that in these years, several senior figures were also split between titles, such as A Link Between Worlds in 2013, and Link's Awakening in 2019. Therefore, let's estimate the second year of each game as having about 100 people working on Breath of the Wild, and given its proportionately larger dev base, 150 on Tears, that adds $9 million to Breath of the Wild's budget and $15 million to Tears of the Kingdom's. However, from 2020, production would really hit maximum velocity. Yes, there are still some developers with credits on games like Switch Sports, but if you look at the major titles that were taking Nintendo's development resources this period, it would have been Splatoon 3 and Zelda, and between those two teams there is very little cross-pollination. Of course, there was also Xenoblade Chronicles 3, but the Monolith Soft Zelda team appears to be broadly separate, although at some point I will investigate further the precise configuration at Monolith Soft. Kirby and the Forgotten Land was also big, but the preserve of external teams, while Pikmin 4 and Super Mario Bros. Wonder were not nearly so extensive, and in any event, Pikmin 4 lent on external partners, notably Eighting, for a good portion of its dev team. Now, Eiji Aonuma stated to Japanese outlet Denfa Minico Game that although initially on Breath of the Wild he tried to make do with a more compact staff team, by the game's height there were 300 internal developers. The total number of Breath of the Wild staff, excluding late game people like testers and localizers, is a little bigger, but that's to be expected with natural staff turnover over a long development cycle. So let's use 300 per year as an estimate for the most intensive period of Breath of the Wild's development, and with Tears staff being about 25% bigger on average, let's say 375 people for Tears. So, for 2015 and 2016 for Breath of the Wild, and 2020 and 2021 for Tears of the Kingdom, we can bank on the full set of staff members working on the game. Of course, because the dev team would include more newer development people, the average salary might be slightly lowered, but any savings would probably be offset, on Tears of the Kingdom at least, by the new COVID costs. Eiji Aonuma has stated that Tears of the Kingdom was finished in 2022, before even the 2022 trailer was announced, but evidently playtesting of such a vast game was a massive endeavour, and he confirmed that they had a week-long test play with all 375 people playing the game to see what they could find, and clearly playtesting would have continued throughout 2022 and 2023, albeit probably with a dwindling number of staff. Still, if we assume 300 people on Breath of the Wild for 2015-2016, that's another 54 million, while that speculated 375 people across the years 2020, 2021, and the first half of 2022 for Tears of the Kingdom would add 93.75 million to that game's budget. Our running totals now have Breath of the Wild at 66.6 million and Tears of the Kingdom at $112.75 million. From the back half of 2022 through to the release of Tears, it's hard to say for sure what many of these developers were doing, as their credits have yet to emerge, but we can see from the fair number of Breath of the Wild team members who worked on Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, ARMS, and other titles that would have required deep development in 2016, that significant numbers would have moved away during the final approach to Tears of the Kingdom's release. Therefore, let's estimate that for the second half of 2022 and the first half of 2023, there were 100 Japan-based dedicated staff up to and including working on the game up to launch, and including some patchwork post-release, coming to a total cost of $10 million. Breath of the Wild was a little different because the core team remained working on DLC. We know from the credits that this was just over 100 people. Let's call it 125, therefore another 11.25 million for the DLC year. So far then, rounding the edges off, we get $78 million for Breath of the Wild and $123 million for Tears of the Kingdom. Again, some of these costs would have been ameliorated in other ways. We've talked about Ring Fit Adventure, but there was also the Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity game. The directors of that game have explained that they were given all of the assets they needed and more beside, and in fact it was the fine details that caused the issues. For example, despite being given very precise specifications as to how to make Breath of the Wild's iconic grass, they still spent a huge amount of development time struggling to recreate it. Since this was a reuse of assets already completed for Breath of the Wild, rather than one still being completed for Tears, you can't really talk about this as a way to defray the Tears of the Kingdom costs. While the first Hyrule Warriors game probably wasn't finalised until Nintendo and Koei Tecmo knew they had a bona fide hit on their hands, it would not surprise me if a Hyrule Warriors sequel to Tears was already accounted for and budgeted for even at this point, in the same way that Koei Tecmo's heavy support of the development of Fire Emblem Three Houses allowed them to reutilise the same assets for Fire Emblem Warriors Three Hopes. However, there is another potential benefit of having this game around the same time, and that is the heavy use of cinematics. Probably more so than either Breath or Tears, Hyrule Warriors is a narrative-heavy game, making strong use of voice acting and motion capture. Monolith Soft's Yoshio Miyake led motion capture for both Breath and Tears, capitalising on experience from Nier Automata and Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and the Hyrule Warriors team seems quite separate, but you have to assume that the extra experience of the supervisors and Nintendo EPD would be helpful as they were planning the cinematics on Tears of the Kingdom. Let's talk music. The full original soundtrack for Breath of the Wild, as best I can tell, is 6.5 hours, with Tears of the Kingdom a little shorter at 4.5 hours, presumably because of the reuse of a lot of music from the prior title. GameDeveloper.com reckons 10 hours per 30 minutes of audio is required by an orchestra. Breath of the Wild has over 50 instrumental credits, one of which is the Philharmonic Chorus of Tokyo. Add in booth people, engineers, contractors for the orchestra, session supervisors, copyists to present the score, plus venue fees, printing of sheet music, agenting and orchestration, plus pickup sessions as well as legal and other fees, and this soon racks up. A 50-piece orchestra, according to GameDeveloper.com, costs $1,500 per hour of studio time. At 10 hours per 30 minutes, that's 130 hours for Breath of the Wild, coming out at $200,000, and $135,000 for Tears of the Kingdom. That's a rounding error in the kind of budgets we're talking about, but still large by any normal game standards. Localization. Okay, this is a tricky one. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom actually had very different localization experiences. Breath of the Wild actually has quite a large number of people credited in both America and Europe, but for Tears of the Kingdom, the number of credited staff is smaller, only around 150 from Nintendo of America. Of course, in recent years, Nintendo has increasingly been contracting out localization work. One such company is LocalSoft SL, who has actually been working with Nintendo as far back as Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, but in recent years has been involved with more and more major titles, including Super Mario RPG and Animal Crossing New Horizons, basically any title with very large text libraries. In fact, the number of total subcontractors on this game is also quite significant, including some new partners for Nintendo, such as Qualia Writers, who seemingly contributed to the original game's text. Still, let's stick with localization for now. The International Game Developers Association actually has a good guide made for indie developers, but which nonetheless contains some good lessons for us on the process of localization that will allow us to make some slightly more accurate estimates. Firstly, Nintendo benefits because it already has contracts with localization specialists. Tears is not the first text-heavy game Nintendo has tried to localize after all, and indeed, 2023 had already seen Fire Emblem Engage. This allows them to have some confidence with contracts and identifying reliable partners. Nonetheless, as well as translating the text, time is required to play the game and check the language is working, ensure the fonts work in different languages, multilingual voices need to be screened, and of course they need to ensure that nothing in the game is likely to offend or upset anybody in the specific regions they're releasing in. Although many of these things are likely to be aided by Nintendo's long-established procedures and experience in the field, I think on the last front they are especially minded to be cautious and to pay good money for sound advice on how to tailor their products to each individual region. On Breath of the Wild, there are teams for localization management, translation, quality assurance, product testing, and copy editing from Nintendo of America. Clearly, most of these people would work on multiple games at once, but Breath of the Wild by any standards will be one of the most labour-intensive titles of the year. Let's say on average 150 people spent an average of 6 weeks localizing the game at slightly less than the Nintendo average salary. That will come to roughly a $1 million spend. I can only assume that the different credit structure on Tears of the Kingdom was an attempt to save money, or at least not to spend any more, so let's use the same $1 million figure for the localization costs of Tears of the Kingdom as well. Voice acting though. There are just over 40 Japanese voices in both games, and voices are available in English, Japanese, French, and Canadian versions of French, Spanish and Latin American Spanish, German, Italian, and Russian. To be fair, on Breath of the Wild, some of these voice options were patched in a couple of months after release, and it's possible they delayed spending money on this until they saw the initial orders coming in. Still, Nintendo aren't using major voice actors, and costs in some parts of the world are probably lower. Plus, not all of these voice actors will be needed for the whole recording stint. Let's assume 20 people were needed for 2 months times 9 versions at an average salary of $40,000 a year for Breath and $50,000 for Tears, given that it was 5 years later, and rehiring the same people for a successful project might have and should have come with some kind of bump in cost. Then you need to consider directing, studio space, casting, agenting, legal fees, and for those ironclad confidentiality agreements, and more beside, and so it probably comes to about $2 million for each game. Across all Nintendo subsidiaries that are involved, plus in Japan, there would be costs associated with HR, insurances, utility, technologies, contingency planning, corporate compliance, and regulatory costs, and other things to factor in that would, yes, be distributed among other games, but could be accounted for proportionally for Tears of the Kingdom's budget, and for that matter, for Breath of the Wild's budget. This really comes down to accounting decisions as to whether or not these are allocated to individual game budgets or not, and the precise scale is very difficult to discern, but let's say it's $1 million a year for 5 years on Breath of the Wild, and 6 years on Tears of the Kingdom. This means that, for the games, the testing, the art, the sound, the voice acting, basically everything playable, my running total is $86 million for Breath of the Wild, and for Tears of the Kingdom, $134 million. And that's the number I guess most people are considering when they refer to the cost of the game. But wait, we have yet to factor in one of the biggest costs of all. For films, often 50% of the spend can be marketing. Certainly games are the same. What was the marketing budget of the Hero of the Wild games? So far, we've been used to Breath of the Wild being less expensive as a project, with a smaller dev team at every stage. But here I think Breath of the Wild was likely a much more expensive proposition than Tears. Think about it. Was Tears of the Kingdom's marketing spend really all that high? Even weeks before the game, we were scratching our heads wondering why the developers were being so quiet about it. In terms of trailers, we had the 2019 trailer, and then trailers in 2021 and 2022, all of which were rather bare bones by comparison to some other trailers. I was as incredibly excited as anyone for Tears of the Kingdom, but while any Zelda revelations were exciting, I'm not sure that any of the trailers were really jaw-droppers in the way that Breath of the Wild often were. And yes, there were advertisements clustered for maximum impact around the launch, but the game wasn't on Jimmy Fallon. They didn't take a whole floor at E3 to dedicate to the new world of Hyrule. My hunch is with Tears that they knew that, in the first instance at least, the game's reputation and hype was sufficient to carry it to large sales, and so they made a deliberate, tactical decision to limit their marketing spend to the window immediately surrounding the game's release in order to maximise their impact, but also to put a greater proportion of their money into the game itself. Basically, let the quality of the game speak for itself. Even the pattern of the teasers is quite different. Breath of the Wild, we saw various teasers, the game being played, and demos at E3, all of which would have required the dev team to make time out to prepare. For Tears though, 2019 was the first time that the team produced any kind of external teaser for the E3 trailer. Now while this footage mostly was not used in the final game, it's possible to imagine that it had been developed with a view to being the introduction to the game, and so it was perhaps not quite as invasive on the team's time as other, perhaps more playable demos. Still, it suggests that some early design work had taken place with the look of the risen Hyrule Castle and the mummified Ganondorf being broadly consistent with what we saw in the final title. This is also the first run out for the now iconic tense music for Ganondorf's revival. But the 2021 and 2022 trailers were also relatively short. There are multiple reasons for this. For one thing, the world had changed. E3 no longer existed, and social media was a stronger force than ever, carrying the message of the game's release far and wide, even without Nintendo's intervention. With Breath of the Wild, it was a new proposition launching untested new hardware after a significant game drought. They needed the advertising spend to explain to people what it was. Tears of the Kingdom was a very different beast. They had a large install base and could reach a vast number of existing players through the Nintendo account system with limited effort. They didn't need to reach out to new players to quite the same degree. Of course, there were a lot of advertisements for Tears of the Kingdom, and perhaps because Nintendo was in such a different position by 2023, and because so much of the Breath of the Wild advertising would have crossed over the Switch itself, the overall cost of the advertising spend, at least as accounted for, could have been even higher. Nevertheless, I'd estimate it to be a relatively small amount compared to other major titles. Nintendo spent $638 on advertising during the April 2022 to March 2023 fiscal year, and this figure seems to be broadly consistent since 2016, when the advertising spend leapt from around $440 million to $685 million between the 16 to 17 and 17 to 18 financial years. And while there would also be costs associated with the 3DS, which remember, launched a new model in 2017, with the mobile, with theme parks and with other Nintendo initiatives, in 2017 at least, I have to believe that a lot of that money was spent around the launch of the new system, and therefore on Breath of the Wild. For Breath of the Wild, it was one of a tiny number of Switch games, and although Splatoon 2, and in particular Super Mario Odyssey, would have required some significant advertising push, I have to think that Breath of the Wild commanded a hefty slice of the pie. Let's assume that 50% of this total spend was allocated to the new 3DS console, the Switch consoles, and other projects such as mobile and theme park and films. Then the remaining 50% would be shared between the various titles with a bias towards the biggest games in the lineup. Therefore, I could see 10% of the $440 million for the 2016 to 2017 year going to Breath, about $44 million, probably a little bit more from the next financial year, but this would have been after the game was released, and so it would be using the money already being recouped from the game's sales. For Tears, with so many other titles Nintendo had to promote, perhaps we're looking closer to 8% of the total. Of course, there would be ongoing advertising costs as well, but since the titles are broadly evergreen, and these initiatives would presumably be self-financing, let's use this figure, which gives us $51 million. Now, although these are massive figures, they are less than half the budget of the games, and I think this reflects the way that Nintendo strategizes, trying to build, as it says, long-term relationships with its customers. Every Zelda title tacitly builds the Zelda brand. Every Mario game tacitly builds the Mario brand, and so it doesn't need to blitz any individual game to quite the same degree. I haven't yet factored in the costs of developing the Wii U and Switch versions of Breath of the Wild. My assumption here is that these are essentially sunk costs that would apply across the development landscape. They would have needed to transition a lot of games over from Wii U to Switch, and as this was happening across the entirety of Nintendo's development teams, hopefully the costs would have been relatively low, or at least absorbed into costs we've already accounted for. On the other hand, Tears of the Kingdom was released on older hardware and had to account for multiple different versions of the Switch, not just the light, OLED and OG models, but also less well-advertised revisions such as the 2019 refresh of the OG Switch. This would have increased the requirement for testing compared to the brand new Switch and a relatively young Wii U, which didn't have spin-offs. All things considered, I'm not inclined to add an extra layer for any of these costs, but rather say they're factored in to the existing calculations. So after all that, after looking at everything and rounding to the nearest million, we get a final total at last of $130 million for Breath of the Wild and $185 million for Tears of the Kingdom. First thing to note, okay, maybe that estimate using Shigeru Miyamoto's statement wasn't quite so bad after all, although I still maintain he was not using 2 million copies as a metric, and in any event Nintendo would not have made back this level of investment from just 2 million copies sold. It is at least within the general ballpark. Tears of the Kingdom was more expensive, but with the additional costs chiefly seeming to be in development time, as on some areas of spending, localization and music, they appear to have tried to manage costs a little more closely, and even if my estimates turn out not to be correct, it's still a rounding error compared to the staffing costs of keeping the very large Zelda team going through that long development cycle. No small amount of money, especially given the games don't consistently hit 1080p resolution. This would make them easily competitive on budgetary terms with, if not the absolute top tier of AAA output across the industry, then certainly the higher echelons, but the actual breakdown of where the money is spent is in some ways quite different. Certainly, a lot on any AAA title is spent with nurturing staff, which is important across the industry, but Nintendo has some definite advantages on this front. Because of their high retention rate and super job satisfaction, they don't have to spend time orientating their new employees to their projects to anything like the same degree as other companies may, because their average tenure at Nintendo is 16 years, and with many of the Zelda people having been on the project for decades. Furthermore, offsetting the large spend up front, look at the sales back end. Yes, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have sold a combined 50 million copies at full price or nearly full price. In fact, at a higher than normal price for Tears of the Kingdom, although this is notionally to cover the increased memory size of the game card. Plus, Breath of the Wild had DLC. But then look at Ring Fit Adventure and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, which utilised assets. In fact, Ring Fit surpassed the sales of Breath of the Wild in the Japanese territory. As well as this, I've no doubt future games will leverage innovations in the Lunchbox engine, just as Shinya Takahashi proposed all the way back in 2015. Whether these developments are in obvious ways, as we saw with Ring Fit Adventure, or in less obvious ways, such as making some of the physics in the next Mario Kart slightly easier to program. Look also at the halo effect around other Zelda games as a result of the success of Breath of the Wild and for the marketing of Tears of the Kingdom, particularly Skyward Sword, which originally had a rather poor reputation, but with a teaser of sky-based gaming just ahead of Tears of the Kingdom was perfectly timed to capitalise on fan hype. Then there's the amiibo, the apparel, the accessories, the special edition versions, the books. The potential of these games is a true step beyond your average Starfield title, and Nintendo knows that these games can be monetized not just in one financial year, but potentially for a lifetime. Look at how a quarter-century-old Game Boy Classic launched the Switch Lite to the world in 2019. As I alluded to before, I don't think Nintendo would ever really narrow down the specific spend on any individual title, and nor could they fully account for the impact of any particular title because they are at heart trying to build a regular cadence of game releases. Remember Shigeru Miyamoto's comments: there will be big hits somewhere in our business and they support the games that fail and allow us to take on other challenges. These titles, and especially Tears, which was developed knowing the success of its predecessor, were always designed to be the massive tentpoles under which the Advance Wars and other codes of the world could shelter. But of course, this is only my estimate. I've tried to make my workings as transparent as possible so you can follow along, and I'd really appreciate your input in the comments to see if we can refine this still further. You might also like to check out some of my other videos on Nintendo developers, on Nintendo's finances, and on various Zelda topics which are floating onto the screen right now. Thank you so much as ever for watching all the way to the end, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.